Hello and welcome. I'm Jemma O'Hanlon, Research and Development Manager at Hort Innovation, and I'm also a dietitian. But I'm absolutely thrilled to share that I have a special guest with us today, Dr. Sue Radd. She's an accredited practicing dietitian. In fact, she's an advanced accredited practicing dietitian, and she has researched extensively in the Mediterranean diet, and she's a huge fan of potatoes. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you, Jemma. Great to be here.
Now, Sue, you have a private practice yourself, and I know there's so many myths that are, buzzing around potatoes, that they're high in carbs and they lead to weight gain, all those things that we know are just simply untrue. So can you tell me about this and set the record straight for us all today?
Well, I think one of the biggest myths floating around social media at present is that all carbs are bad, full stop. And especially with regards to potatoes, that all potatoes, regardless of how cooked or produced, are very high in their glycemic effect. And this, of course, is completely untrue, because the research presently is showing that it's the quality of the carbohydrates we consume that determines their health effects. If you consume refined carbohydrates, carbohydrates cooked in unhealthy ways, they can have a negative effect. But if you consume carbohydrates, including whole potatoes as whole foods, unrefined and cooked using more traditional methods, actually their consumption is associated with lower risk of various chronic diseases. And that fits completely within what we've known about blue zones. These are longevity hotspots in the world. These are high carb diets, and they include foods like potato, but they don't include highly refined, ultra-processed carbohydrate food. So it all goes back to quality. Just like oils ain't oils, the quality of carbohydrate is crucially important.
What about other nutrient attributes of potatoes? They're obviously really rich in those, wholesome carbohydrates that we know are good for us, aligned with those blue zones diets. Now, what are the other benefits to eating potatoes?
Well, I think one of the outstanding benefits is they're an excellent source of energy. So energy is calories or kilojoules, fuel for our bodies to run on, and our body, particularly our brain, prefers carbohydrate. But at the same time, they don't provide excessive amounts of carbohydrate, and they're quite easily to sort of portion control. So for example, 100 grams of potato provides about 300 kilojoules. So that's less than, half a cup of, say, rice or pasta. So they're less calorie dense than some other carbohydrate foods. And with regards to their energy content, Jemma, I'm just fascinated. When you look back in history, they were prized for this contribution. I mean, we all know about the Irish and potatoes, but did you know that Catherine the Great ran a pro-potato campaign in the 18th century to try and avoid famine? Yeah, and even in Germany, there are records that the part of the Industrial Revolution was fueled by potato, Kartoffel. So I think energy source, a valuable energy source, the right amount, not too much. The other thing I think that's really important about potatoes is they can be a really valuable source of dietary fibre. Mm-hmm. But even more exciting to me is that this more recent discovery is that they can also be a valuable source of something called resistant starch. Now, most health professionals will have heard of resistant starch, but for anyone else that's watching and has never heard of this, resistant starch can be formed when you cook and quickly cool potatoes. And years ago, we didn't appreciate why resistant starch was so important. But we now understand that resistant starch is really another type of dietary fibre that's really important for a healthy microbiome, a healthy gut to feed up those good bacteria. Just like resistant starch is formed when you cook things like polenta or mealie meal. Upon cooling, you form a lot of resistant starch. The same thing happens with potato, and it's a really important nutrient to, for healthy gut health, or at least for good gut health, and then good health of the body, since everything's connected with the gut.
Now tell me, if I need to cook my potatoes, cool them down, how quickly does that resistant starch develop?
It develops within, I guess, the first half an hour to an hour of cooling. And what the tip I give my patients is actually not to cook potatoes today and eat them now, but in order to save time, to cook them on the weekend. Cook enough for a few days, have them in the fridge. It will definitely be formed at that stage, you know. And years ago, we didn't have a clue how important this resistant starch was. But back in the 70s, Dr. Dennis Burkett, who actually postulated the fiber hypothesis, he was doing a lot of research in Africa, particularly comparing the diets of rural Africans to the British and others. And even though when you look at standard food composition tables, some of these healthy foods like maize or potatoes don't seem to score as high in dietary fiber that's currently recorded, this resistant starch is formed. And he found that their diet was really rich in resistant starch. And this is one of the thoughts as to why they have such low rates of gut disorders, low rates of colon cancer, and so on. So I think potatoes have the same thing going for them as long as we treat them correctly, cook them in the ways that they used to be cooked, which is pre-cooked, and particularly in the Mediterranean diet, and then cooled and then consumed later. And it doesn't matter how you torture them later, Jemma, they still retain some or most of that resistant starch. So that's good to know.
That is fantastic. And I often will do a big roast up of vegetables on a Sunday night and lots of potatoes in there. And then I've got lunches for the week. So I love that I'm getting even more benefits of the resistant starch for my gut health by doing so. And it saves me having to cook them up all the time during the week because I've already done it.
Massive time saver. Yeah. And the other thing I might just mention, Jemma, is vitamin C. One doesn't often think of potatoes as akin to oranges, right? Everyone thinks of oranges. But actually, did you know that the sailors from Portugal and from Spain, or at least potato is credited from preventing scurvy in those sailors when Columbus traveled to the New World and found the potato and found, you know, tomatoes because of this vitamin C content. So they're actually quite valuable in their vitamin C content if you eat enough of them. So that's another benefit.
That's fantastic. Isn't that just, yeah, it goes back to the whole food, doesn't it? And how nutrient rich they are.
Yes, and even potassium. So, you know, again, we think of bananas, but potatoes also supply potassium, even more than a banana. And if you look at some studies, there are these interesting associations that diets rich in plant foods, including potatoes, are strongly associated with lower blood pressure, lower cholesterol, lower inflammatory markers. So there are lots of these, you know, nutrients in potatoes that can contribute. But Jemma, the most exciting area at the moment, and I just want to show you something, is the area, of course, research on phytonutrients, as we call them. There's also great value in using these lovely coloured pigmented potatoes. You know, a massive area of research, of course, is in polyphenols, and health professionals will be aware of that. And we've often thought of polyphenols as things that exist in fruits and vegetables. But lo and behold, they also exist in potatoes that have these beautiful skins. So I've got a couple to show you. So here's my royal blue. Can you see how beautiful this guy is?
Yes.
He also has a lovely yellow flesh, but this colour, this purplish colour, the pigment responsible for that is the same pigment that you'll find in blueberries. So these are anthocyanins, which are a subclass of flavonoids, which of course are a class of polyphenols, which we've known for some time have these strong antioxidant, anti-inflammatory properties. And more recently, we're discovering that they actually affect in a positive way the microbiota.
Really? That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I'll show you another one of my favourites, and I'm going to cut him because I want to show you the inside. Here we go. This is the Dutch cream. Can you see, Jemma, how yellowy this guy is?
Yeah, very yellow.
Okay, he looks like the ordinary dirty brown potato, but he's got a really lovely yellowy, you know, flesh.
Golden colour. It's like a sunset kind of colour.
It's absolutely gorgeous. And I can tell you in the Mediterranean, even today in Greece, in summer, they use these kind of potatoes and they slow bake them in the oven, and they're beautiful and yellowy inside. So these pigments, whether they're from within or on the outside of the potato, are not just there for good looks. They actually deliver health benefits.
That's fantastic. And I've got a potato here. These are the potatoes that I get in my veggie box every week from a local farm in Victoria. They look like they've just come straight from the ground, which they have. Now, tell me, obviously there's pigmented potatoes, but of course, you know, if you can't find the coloured ones, then these are still good for you, right?
Absolutely. And I think the variety of potatoes over time, just like the variety of other vegetables over time, is really important. And even with those plain ones that don't have the colours on the outside and not so yellow on the inside, they can still be a valuable source of that resistant starch that we discussed earlier. So as long as we cook them, cool them, keep them in our fridge and eat them over a few days, we're going to get the benefit from that resistant starch, which is so important for good health.
So, Sue, most people wouldn't really associate the humble spud with the Mediterranean diet, but I believe it has played a really key role over time. Can you tell me more?
This is true, Jemma. However, it was not part of the ancient Mediterranean diet, as was not tomato. And everyone thinks tomato was forever within the Mediterranean. In fact, in ancient days, they used to use chestnuts for the carbohydrate. They would make chestnut cakes and chestnut breads. But when Columbus discovered the New World and brought back the tomato and the potato and, you know, corn and these kind of things to Europe, potatoes became accepted right across Europe and within the Mediterranean and became something that's quite beloved and were grown quite widely. So in the traditional Mediterranean diet, which is actually characterized in the scientific literature, at least in the era of the 1950s, early 1960s, at a time where we didn't have, you know, massive globalization of food, factory farms, ultra-processed food wasn't around, potatoes were a part of the regular diet. In fact, if you have a look at one of the earliest studies that was actually sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation in the US, where they went to the island of Crete, because of course Crete after the war was very poor. Cretan people were very poor and they ate what they could grow, including potatoes. They found that on average people were consuming about 1 kilogram per week. Okay.
Wow, that's
so this is just average. So obviously some people, like men, would be consuming more. We know that in rural parts they were consuming more. Also during fasting, Greek Orthodox fasting, which means they fast from animal foods, no meat, no dairy. Much more potato was even consumed then. So potatoes were certainly a significant part of the diet, as was bread, and even in everyday life, you know, they ate more potatoes than they consumed meat. But if you look at what's happening around today, if you go to an Italian or a Greek restaurant, you know, in a Western country, you'll see a big slab of meat. You're lucky to get a real potato. People might order fast food, might order French fries, but to get the real potato is not something you commonly see. So yes, very much part of the traditional dietary pattern, which I should also add, Jemma, is a plant-based dietary pattern. So they're part of, you know, that pattern. They're within the context of that pattern. And interestingly, even more recent research suggests if they're part of that dietary pattern, they seem to provide very positive health effects. At least one study that I'm just recalling at the moment, looking at risk of, say, type 2 diabetes. In this particular study where they used what's called the MED diet score, and you have these diet index scores that assess how much somebody's sticking or complying to a certain pattern, and where they specifically measure potato as a separate element, which is not done by all scores, they found that the higher the score of that Mediterranean diet adherence, the lower the risk of type 2 diabetes. So it certainly seems that within the context of a rich plant-based dietary pattern, and when potato is used as a vegetable and cooked using traditional methods, there isn't a concern of any harm, but in fact there might be some really positive health effects that would come, you know, to fruition if you consumed it often enough.
The whole myth around potato consumption and diabetes, you know, other conditions, completely, you know, it's completely untrue.
Look, I think the problem has been a lot of the earlier studies lumped all carbs together. healthy carbs and not so healthy carbs, and fast food things, which I actually don't even think of as potato. So I don't honestly think of hot chips as potato. I think of them as hot chips. They're a discretionary food. Potatoes are a vegetable, and I think we need to be thinking of them as a whole food and as a vegetable and as part of that very diet. And actually, Jemma, I'll show you something else. I prepared this earlier. This is for my lunch today. This is my village vegetable stew here. I don't know how much you can see. This is one of the recipes from my Food as Medicine cookbook, where I have a lot of Mediterranean style recipes. We have zucchinis, we have green beans, we have, eggplant. Of course, we have potato, because in the Mediterranean, they would always throw in a potato for good measure, to bulk out the dish, and for satiety. They knew that eating potatoes filled you up. So potatoes were regularly and commonly used as part of that traditional Mediterranean dietary pattern.
That's one thing I love about potatoes, is they fill me up. Like, I could have one of these with, a balanced meal, and I am so full. They're really filling. And I think it just goes back to that whole fact that they're a whole food. This is how they get pulled out of the ground, and all you need to do is bake them or steam them or boil them, and they're ready to go. And on that note, Sue, can you tell me what is the best way to cook potatoes?
Tricky question. Look, I cook them in many different ways. Okay, and it depends on the potato. It's the same with legumes. It depends on the bean. So I love them in stews. In the Mediterranean, they add them to soups, or pre-cooked. For example, they add them to bitter greens. So in the Mediterranean, in years gone by, they didn't have a gas stove. The main meal of the day was the midday meal. It was the biggest meal, and that might have been cooked in the morning. Foods were usually only cooked once a day, if you were lucky. So the food would be cooked and then cooled. And so the cool potatoes would then be tossed in with these bitter greens that they would pick from the mountains. So you can just do so many things. They turn them into dips. Of course, you'd be familiar with scordaglià, which is a potato and garlic. Absolutely delicious dish. And, of course, the humble potato salad. We can't go beyond potato salad. Now, on that, Jemma, with regards to the potato salad, let me show you what a Mediterranean style potato salad looks like.
That looks very vibrant.
I use whichever onions I have. Obviously, I've used purple onions here today because, again, they're rich in anthocyanins. And I've also used Desiree potatoes today, and I'll just stab one to show you. Here's the little pink skin. So keep the skin on when you can. Often, potatoes are peeled when you make salad because sometimes the skin comes off. But when you're cooking for home, it really doesn't matter. But the interesting thing here as to why this makes potatoes so healthy in this dish is, one, it's pre-cooked, it's cooled, it's used the next day. So you form this resistant starch. It means it's going to have a lower glycemic index and also feed the good microbiota in your gut. Two, we've added a lot of extra virgin olive oil. Now, what does extra virgin olive oil do to the glycemic index? It also dampens. Right. Three, usually in the Mediterranean, they will either add a bit of vinegar, okay, or a bit of lemon juice. And which also dampens the glycemic response. So if you've got a dish with potatoes and you've got beautiful extra virgin olive oil and you've got an acid like vinegar, and you've got these cooked and cool potatoes, this is not going to be a high GI dish as, for example, if you were just to mash potatoes and eat them hot, cooked. We're talking about completely different things, and it's really fascinating because even, some people would be concerned about consuming, say, gnocchi. To make gnocchi, you've got to mash the potato, right? But gnocchi is, again, quite a complex food. And a lot of our composition tables, even with regards to the glycemic index, have not measured a lot of these differently, traditionally cooked dishes. There was a study published looking at gnocchi, or potato dumplings as they call them, and they found that the GI was not high. It was about 53. Okay, when compared to glucose. This is not high GI. When they looked at the starch molecules using electron microscope, they found that the starch was more compact. So something's happening in that cooking process. So there are many such foods that might have been consumed traditionally, and you just can't tell by looking on the outside and guessing what's going to happen. You have to test them.
And so I guess to that point, I mean, glycemic index is one measure as part of many other ways to evaluate the nutritional value of food. And as dietitians, we know that. And I think that's, unfortunately, that's sort of gotten out there with the everyday person, and they see that some potatoes may have a higher GI, but as you said, there are so many ways that you can reduce the GI with other foods, and of course choosing other foods like other types of potatoes, and obviously the way you cook them also impacts the GI. So I think that's
right. That's right. And the other thing is, Jemma, I couldn't help but remember what a good friend of mine and dear colleague, Professor David Jenkins, who's the father of the glycemic, said to me many years ago. He said, don't forget it's the whole meal. We often forget that. People just focus on these single foods. So if you have, say, potatoes in the context of a lentil soup, which is how they would have been eaten, this is a low GI meal. Okay, you can add other foods to the meal or other ingredients, as we mentioned, the olive oil or the vinegar. It's the glycemic response or the impact of the meal, and also of all the meals during the day. That's most important. So these combinations, knowing what to put with what, you can safely include potato in your diet. If you know how to cook it and what to team it up with, will further drop the glycemic response.
So now there's lots of varieties of potatoes out there in our farmers markets and supermarkets, and I guess for all the people out there, watching today, what would your tips be? Can we just go and grab any potatoes, and what's the best way to cook them and store them as well?
Sure. Look, I think the first point is, the practical tip is, think of potatoes as a vegetable and include them as part of a dietary pattern that's very rich in plant foods and a range of colours. And so where that comes to potatoes, of course, when you can grab the pigmented ones, that's good. When you can't, they can still deliver benefits. So the second point is how to cook them and how to store them. You can steam them, you can microwave them. Traditionally they even boil them, and they still have benefits in that regard. But the important thing is, cook them ahead. You'll save yourself time, store them in your fridge. That'll form that resistant starch, which is a really important source of dietary fibre for the good microbiome, in our gut, or the good microbiota at least. The other thing is, don't forget seasonings. So additions that you can add to the meal or to the recipes, not just for beautiful flavour so you can enjoy the potatoes, but also that will dampen any glycemic response. So things like olive oil, lemon vinegar, these were all used as part of the Mediterranean diet.
I like to have a bit of rosemary with my roasted potatoes. What do you think about that?
Brilliant. And of course, the Greeks will always have a lot of origami. So one of my favourite dishes, Jemma, is lemon potatoes. And I use these Dutch creams in that case because they're long and they're really, really yellow. And you literally put a ton of lemon juice, a lot of olive oil, and you could put rosemary, you could put oregano, you could use thyme, you could use any herbs. And this also retards the formation of any chemicals which you find in fast food, such as acrylamide, advanced glycation end products. So I think the key message is, if you treat the potato with respect, treat it like a vegetable as it is, you can eat it safely, you can enjoy it, and you can also gain nutritional and health benefits.
Wow, you have just wrapped that up so beautifully, Sue. That is just such a wonderful takeaway. So I think we're going to finish on that note. Now, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Sue. Your wisdom, experience, and knowledge is just amazing, and I just love your passion for the Mediterranean diet and sharing all this knowledge with us today. And I do want to send people over now to the Australian Potatoes website, so aussiepotatoes.com. We've got stacks of resources, fact sheets, infographics galore, so go and check those out, guys. And thank you again, Sue. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here today.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks, Jemma.